Imagine finding peace after years of chaos, only to discover that the people you left behind still need you. That is where Ted Lasso's new chapter begins. After everything that happened in Richmond, Ted had returned to Kansas and tried to build a quieter life. But Richmond wasn't finished with Ted, and now he's back. Except this time, things are very different, because Ted isn't returning to coach the same Richmond team. He's facing an entirely new challenge, a women's football team, the Lady Greyhounds. And if you think Ted's biggest problem will be teaching them football, think again, because the real challenge isn't the sport. It's getting a group of very different people to believe that they belong together. And that is exactly what makes Season 4 so interesting. The first 3 seasons were largely about Ted teaching Richmond how to believe. Now, Ted has to learn how to believe in a completely different future himself. Season 4 officially brings Ted back to Richmond for his biggest challenge yet, coaching a second division women's football team. Apple describes the season as a story about Ted and the team learning to take chances they never thought they would. But episode 3 is where we begin to see what that challenge actually means. And that's where our story begins. At first, everything appears relatively normal. Ted is doing what Ted does best. He's smiling, he's encouraging people, he's trying to make everyone feel comfortable. But underneath that optimism, there is uncertainty. The players don't necessarily know what Ted's arrival means. The coaching staff doesn't know exactly how this experiment is going to work, and Ted himself may not have all the answers. That's important, because Ted has always been extremely good at making other people feel confident. But confidence and certainty are 2 completely different things, and this new team is about to test that difference. The tension begins when, and suddenly, Ted's carefully positive approach isn't enough. Someone challenges him, someone questions the team's direction, or perhaps the players themselves begin questioning whether this new system can actually work. Whatever the specific confrontation in episode 3 reveals, this is the larger question underneath it. Can Ted Lasso build another team from the ground up, without simply repeating what he did before? Because this isn't Richmond 2.0. These players have their own personalities, their own ambitions, their own fears, and their own reasons for wanting to succeed. And that makes this challenge much more complicated. But then, something happens that changes the mood completely. No one expected what happens next. And suddenly, this isn't just about football anymore. It's personal. The interesting thing about Ted Lasso has always been that the football is only half the story. The real game is happening inside the characters, and episode 3 continues that tradition. As the Lady Greyhounds begin adjusting to Ted's methods, cracks start appearing. One player wants one thing, another player wants something completely different, and Ted is caught in the middle. Normally, Ted's instinct would be to make everyone feel better, but that's not always the right answer. Sometimes leadership means allowing people to be uncomfortable. Sometimes the coach can't fix everything, and that's a lesson Ted has had to learn throughout the series, because Ted's greatest strength can also become his greatest weakness. He wants everyone to be okay, but football doesn't work that way. Someone has to lose. Someone has to make a difficult decision. Someone has to accept responsibility. And eventually, Ted has to decide whether being liked is more important than being respected. This decision becomes one of the most important moments of the episode, because Ted isn't simply coaching tactics, he's shaping the culture of this team, and that's where the supporting characters become important. Rebecca is still deeply connected to Richmond. Keeley is dealing with her own professional and emotional challenges. Roy remains Roy, which means he probably has absolutely no interest in making things easy for anybody. And Coach Beard, well, Beard is Beard. Together, they create something that feels familiar, but the new team changes the dynamic. The old Richmond family isn't exactly the same anymore, and that's deliberate. Season 4 isn't trying to pretend that time hasn't passed. It has. People have changed, relationships have changed, and some people who once felt essential to Richmond are no longer there. One of the biggest examples is Jamie Tart. Season 4 has already established that Jamie is no longer with AFC Richmond, having moved to FC Barcelona. His absence is one of the clearest reminders that the old Richmond era is over. That matters because Ted now has to build something new, not rebuild the past, build the future. A character says something, or does something, that reveals what they've really been thinking, and suddenly the conflict becomes much deeper, because what looked like a football problem was actually an identity problem. Someone doesn't believe they belong, someone is afraid of failing, someone is desperate to prove themselves, and someone else is terrified that they might lose control. Ted sees it, and instead of immediately giving everyone an inspirational speech, he does something unexpected.
This is where episode 3 becomes much more than another football story. The pressure finally reaches the pitch. The Lady Greyhounds have something to prove. But the problem is, wanting something isn't the same as knowing how to achieve it. The team starts making mistakes. One mistake becomes another. The pressure increases, and suddenly, all the confidence Ted tried to build is being tested. This is the moment where the episode asks its biggest question. What happens when believing isn't enough? Ted could step in. He could take control. He could give another motivational speech. But perhaps that's exactly what the team doesn't need. Because a good coach doesn't create players who depend on him. A good coach creates players who can eventually stand without him. And that distinction is crucial. At first, it seems like a setback, but look closer. It may actually be the moment the team begins changing, because failure forces everyone to confront something they were avoiding. The player who is hiding behind confidence can no longer hide. The player who doubted herself has to make a decision, and Ted has to accept that he can't control the outcome. This is one of the deepest ideas in Ted Lasso. You can prepare, you can care, you can encourage, but eventually you have to let people make their own choices. And Ted's journey has always been about learning exactly that. The old Ted believed that if he could make everyone happy, everything would work out. The newer Ted understands something much harder. Sometimes helping someone means letting them struggle, and that's exactly what happens here. For a moment, the comedy disappears, the football disappears, and we're simply watching people trying to understand themselves. That is when the episode delivers its emotional punch. Because beneath all the jokes in football, Ted Lasso has always been about one thing: people trying to become better versions of themselves, and the Lady Greyhounds are beginning that journey. But there is still one problem. The season is only getting started, and whatever happens here is likely to have consequences later. Now we reach the final section, and this is where the episode's real meaning becomes clear. The immediate problem is resolved, or at least partially resolved. But Ted Lasso rarely gives us a simple victory. Instead, the characters walk away having learned something, and that lesson matters more than the score. The most important thing about this ending is that Ted doesn't simply solve the team's problem. The team begins solving it themselves, and that distinction tells us exactly what Season 4 is trying to do. This isn't about Ted returning to recreate the past. It's about Ted helping create something that didn't exist before. A new team, a new generation of players, a new Richmond, and perhaps a new Ted. Look at where this character started. He arrived in England as an outsider. Everyone underestimated him. He knew almost nothing about English football, but he understood people. Over time, Richmond became more than a football club. It became a family. Now Ted has returned, but the family has changed, and so has he. That is why Episode 3 matters. It isn't simply another chapter in the football season. It's another test of whether Ted can move forward without constantly looking backward. There may also be several small callbacks hidden throughout the episode. That's something Ted Lasso has always done extremely well. A joke can have meaning, a photograph can have meaning, a familiar object can remind us of an earlier season, and even a seemingly harmless conversation can foreshadow something much bigger. So when you watch Episode 3 again, pay attention, because the writers may be telling us what comes next without actually saying it. And that brings us to the final moment. The episode ends, but the story doesn't feel finished. Instead, we're left with a question. What happens when this new team finally faces a challenge big enough to break them? Will Ted's optimism survive? Will the players finally trust one another? And perhaps the biggest question of all, can Ted build something new without losing the people who made Richmond special? We don't know yet, but that's exactly why the next episode matters. Because Episode 3 isn't necessarily about reaching the finish line, it's about putting the pieces into position. And if Ted Lasso has taught us anything, it's that the most important victories aren't always the ones on the scoreboard. Sometimes the biggest victory is simply deciding to try again. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you think Ted can turn the Lady Greyhounds into a team capable of challenging the best clubs in England? Because if Episode 3 is any indication, Ted's biggest coaching challenge may have only just begun, and the next match could change everything.